preliminary observations on some exegetical fragments on Acts.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Professor Houghton, for accepting my proposal and having me here today. As the title suggests, my presentation is about exegetical fragments from Codex Vaticanus Reginensis Graecus VI, or minuscule 8086 in the Gregorian numbering, a 13th/14th century Greek minuscule manuscript preserving, among others, two incomplete catenae on the Acts of the Apostles, which are thereby fragmentary pieces of exegesis. During the course of this colloquium, we have already had the chance to hear interesting papers about catenae. Therefore, I will not spend time tracing the complex, fascinating history of this peculiar type of commentary. Nevertheless, I will first summarize the current state of research on catenae on Acts, which I am investigating in my doctoral thesis as part of the CATENA project at the ITSE in Birmingham. The standard classification of catenae on Acts is currently that of the Clavis Patrum Graecorum, or CPG. This divides the diverse texts into three main types: catena Andreae, commentari pseudo-ecumeni, and commentari pseudo-Theophylacti. In addition, two categories of non-Greek catenae are provided in a recent updated edition, catena Arabica and catenae Paleoslavicae. For each type, bibliographical references are listed, which include 16th to 19th century printed editions of selected manuscripts. More specifically, in chronological order, the catena attributed to Ecumenius, who lived in the 6th century, was printed from GA 91 by Donatus of Verona in 1532. Then, in 1631, Frederick Morel produced an edition containing the Greek text by Donatus and the Latin translation by John Henton. This edition eventually found its way into Migne's Patrologia Graeca. Ecumenius Catenae on Acts was also published by Theoclitus Pharmakidis in 1842. Migne also reprinted the edition by Finettus of three different catenae on Acts attributed to Theophylact, an 11th century bishop of Bulgaria. The first catena, from GA 1524, had been previously published by Siphanius in 1557. The other two texts were based on GA 1842 and GA 455, respectively. In 1838, John Kramer published a Catena on Acts as the third of his 8 volumes of New Testament catenae. This was based on a 12th century manuscript, GA 2818, with an appendix containing variants from GA 307. In this manuscript, the catena is attributed to Andreas, perhaps to be identified with Andreas the Presbyter, compiler of a catena on Isaiah. A selection of scholia from GA 2818 had already been published by Johann Christoph Wolff in 1723. Finally, selected scholia on Acts were also published by Mattei in Volume 5 of his edition of the New Testament, 1782. These were taken from 4 different catena manuscripts, GA 101, GA 103, GA 462, GA 463. As one can see, these editors only made use of the few witnesses at their disposal. The manuscript tradition, however, is much richer, as already noted by scholars from the 20th century. In particular, Hermann von Soden, Georg Caro, and Hans Litzmann attempted a first classification of catena manuscripts, whereas Karl Stab and Robert de Vries provided short descriptions and general information on the catena on Acts as part of a broader history of New Testament catenae. More recently, Georgi Parpilov of the Catena project has prepared a full catalogue of Greek New Testament catena manuscripts, including new witnesses absent from the Kurzgefasste Liste. This catalogue contains about 60 catena manuscripts on Acts, whose type was yet to be identified. As a member of the Catena project, I was responsible for conducting a comparison of exegetical scholia in selected text passages to determine the different types of catena in these exemplars and their mutual relationship. This research led me to conclude that the classification of catenon acts in the CPG needs revising so as to include subdivisions within the individual types. One result of the survey is to reveal the diversity of the tradition. Several witnesses to the mainstream catenae are essentially mere copies, repeating the same text with only minor variations. Some preserve abbreviated, reworked, or even mixed versions of the principal types. Others include additional exegetical material, and a small group of manuscripts cannot be directly identified with a non-catena type. I have identified 7 codices singuli. 3 of these have been recently assigned a clavis number in the Clavis Clavium database. As for the remaining 4, there is also a strong case for the inclusion of GA 886 as a codex singulus, not least because it transmits a very singular example of a double catenon acts, albeit fragmentary. And here we come to the proper subject of the presentation. Minuscule 886 is a 13th/14th century manuscript containing the text of the New Testament, except the Catholic epistles, with a commentary. However, the text and the commentary on Acts are incomplete. They stop at Acts 759, folio 205 verso, and so is the Revelation. Folio 336 recto only has Revelation 22, 1-2 with scholia. I will come back to this later. The text of Matthew is also preceded by a list of kephalaia or chapter readings. In addition, at folio 1 verso is an excerpt from Theodoret and underneath an inscription in iambic distic. Finally, in the top margin of folio 208 recto, before Romans, is a dodecasyllabic epigram written by a different hand. The text is available on the database of Byzantine book epigrams. According to Kurt and Barbara Allen, the biblical text of all books is a representative of the Byzantine text type, category 5. Nevertheless, the manuscript was selected for inclusion in the ECM of Acts, where its 7 extant chapters have an agreement with the Byzantine text of about 91%. The manuscript comprises 336 paper leaves, size 34.6 centimeters by 24.5 centimeters. It is written in 1 column per page, 59 lines per page. The main script resembles what Herbert Hunger named Fettaugenmode, a style emerged in the second half of the 13th century. However, the section on Acts 2:14 to 7:59 is transcribed by a 14th century hand, approximately 42 lines per page, somewhat similar to the so-called Metokite style current in the 1320s to 1350s. Currently, the manuscript is housed at the Vatican Library in Rome under the shelf mark Reginensis Grecus 6. Its previous owners included Ignatius Cortasmenus, Macarius, abbot of the monastery of San Marina, and Demetrius Lascaris Leontari. This information is provided in a note in Greek at the end of the text of Acts, and a Latin note on the next page. The note on folio 205 verso may explain why the Kurzke Faste Liste, based on Gregory, currently assigns this manuscript a date of 1454, despite its 13th century hand. In fact, following the Byzantine practice to date manuscripts from the creation, 5508 BCE, the date given in the manuscript is 6954, which equates to the year 1446. The INTF date may simply be a correction of the year based on the last 2 digits, id est 54, not realizing that the full Byzantine date needs to be calculated. In any case, the date of the colophon has no bearing on the manuscript's date of production. Basing on the paleographical evidence, the manuscript could be dated as early as the second half of the 13th century. It was acquired by Christian Roy in the 17th century before passing to the Vatican. Digitized microfilm images are available on the NTV-MR. Based on the titles in the Codex and on a librarian's note in the front page, the commentary on the Gospels is attributed to Nicetas of Naupactus, otherwise unknown. An inscription before Romans states that the commentary on the Pauline epistles seems also to be written by Nicetas, who largely draws on the commentaries by Theophylact of Bulgaria and Chrysostom. No author, however, is assigned to the commentaries on Acts and Revelation. Some scholars, such as Herbert Herard, believe that the authorship of Nicetas should also be extended to the commentary on Acts, following a marginal note on folio 2 recto. This is linked to the name Nicetas in the title of the commentary on Matthew, and ascribes to him an exegetical work on Acts. Other scholars, such as Royce, argue that this attribution is limited to the commentary on Matthew, whereas the other three, on Mark, Luke, and John, must be genuinely works by Theophylact. For the moment, the question remains open. The rest of this presentation will focus on the commentary on Acts. As mentioned above, this is incomplete and was copied by two different hands. The first hand is responsible for Acts 1 to 2:13, whereas the second hand supplies Acts 2:14 to 7:59. However, not only are the two fragmentary texts transcribed by different copyists, but they also reflect the different types of catena on Acts, two different types of catena on Acts. I will provide a brief description of the second text, whose features are typical of the mainstream kind of catena, and then move to the first text, which presents more singular characteristics. The second text is written as an alternating catena. The biblical text is distinguished by some of the same means as the lemmata in single-author commentaries. In this case, by leaving a blank space within a line, by rubrication, by punctuation such as a double dot or the colon. The same punctuation may also be employed to mark the end of a scholium. The order of each comment is normally identified through an abbreviation or monogram. In this case, we can see the use of Q-row for Chrysostomu and of 2au for 202, employed to mark passages from the same author. According to Karen and Litzman and Stab, this catena is accepted from the Andreas catena, with a particular preference for comments from Chrysostom. In fact, my investigation reveals that all the scholia in this catena are found in the Andreas catena, which contains others not present in this manuscript. Although this could therefore be an abbreviated version of the Andreas catena, Divres believed that it might instead be a late witness to an early stage of the Andreas catena. It is possible that the original basis of the Andreas compilation was mostly or even entirely made of excerpts from Chrysostom's homilies on Acts and subsequently expanded with extracts from other exegesis. Support for this may be offered by the title of the Andreas catena, which in all witnesses reads Exegesis of Acts by Chrysostom and other different commentators. On the other hand, Chrysostom might have been emphasized in the title because he is the most frequently cited author throughout the catena. As a matter of fact, Chrysostom's 55 homilies on Acts and 4 homilies in Principium Actorum are the only commentaries on the subject that are transmitted in their entirety. Turning to the first commentary on Acts, we can see that it displays a very distinctive profile. The portions of biblical text are more consistent, as is the commentary section. In addition to rubrication, the biblical text is distinguished by a double dot, the colon, followed by a horizontal line at the end of the passage. The other catena on Acts does not use the horizontal line. The most striking differences, however, involve the text of the commentary. Unlike the standard catena, this is not made of attributed scholia following one another and identified by ending marks. At first sight, it resembles a single author commentary. Nevertheless, my preliminary survey shows that this is a patchwork of fragments combined from patristic sources. More precisely, the compiler seems to have made a selection of extracts in order to create a running commentary, perhaps with a distinctive theological point of view, although this point is yet to be addressed. The size of the exegetical material ranges from minimal text units, such as short phrases, to more extensive blocks, including sentences and clauses. The most curious feature is that the sources are not mentioned, and comments from different fathers are blended in such a way that the whole work resembles a chaotic mass, as Stab deemed it. However, this kind of compilation is not unusual in patristic literature. It finds a parallel in the Catenon Acts attributed to Ecumenius and Theophylact. Some scholars, such as Guy de Rival, suggest that compilations of this kind, based on catenae but lacking source indications, are better labeled as commentaries. Nevertheless, given their origins in catena tradition, no proposal has yet been made to change the traditional classification. One could rather suggest that these works are simply representatives of an alternative type of catena. I will now list the sources employed in the first compilation on Acts, which I identified mainly through the TLG and also by comparison with the Andreas catena. It is not clear whether the compiler from GA 886 read the Andreas catena in its full form as provided by Kramer, or most likely in a later stage where some source indications had been omitted. The latter seems to be suggested by a passage which is introduced by the formula eipedetis os, someone said that, which in the Andreas catena is identified as an extract from Severian of Gabala. What is more, the following sentences are to scholia from Chrysostom, which are placed in the same order as in the Andreas catena. Furthermore, GA 886 exhibits some extracts from Chrysostom which appear in the Andreas catena but are not transmitted in the direct tradition of Chrysostom's homilies on Acts. One of these is incorporated into the passage from Severian seen above. It is unusual that here the authorship of Chrysostom is indicated in a marginal note, as the compiler tends to avoid quoting the source of the extracts. I will now provide a few examples of the compilation practice adopted by our compiler. For the time being, the focus will be exclusively on the collocation of the extracts and the linguistic interventions in the sources with regard to the portions of text shared with the sources. And I will not consider the additions or the impact of the text reuse on the exegetical content. These points will be addressed later in my research. The compilation practice seems to follow two main patterns. One, verbatim copy of the extract, consisting of reproducing the extract exactly as it appears in the original source, and two, the so-called cut and paste technique, consisting of omitting from the source the words, clauses, and sentences considered unnecessary for the explanation of the biblical passages, as well as introducing linking words and grammatical adjustments. Overall, this kind of intervention abbreviates the source, yet preserves the author's style. In this first sample, the compiler reproduces word by word an entire extract from Severian of Gabala, found in the Andreas catena. As one can see, almost every single word of the source is replicated faithfully. Only minor variations occur in the vocabulary. In two cases, the change of vocabulary seems to reflect a preference for simplification, as two phrases from the original source are replaced with single-word synonyms. Here we have the first example of the cut and paste technique, applied in the same section to a passage from Chrysostom's Homily 1 on Acts. Unlike the previous case, the compiler does not copy the passage in full. Instead, he selects a few phrases, sentences, and blocks of text and collocates them one after another, following the same order as in the original passage, though in a rather abbreviated form. Once again, minor changes are made. These variations are a grammatical adjustment, the employment of morphological variants, and lexical synonyms. The most significant change is the replacement of apen with ecusas. In the original, the subject of apen is the author of acts, whereas ecusas indicates the present reader, who is also the subject of the purpose clause in amenomyces ifeteron auton aneilefte. This third example shows how the compiler selects extracts of variable length from different sections of Chrysostom's homily 3 on Acts, and combines them in an order which does not necessarily reflect that of the original source. Not only are the sentences from chapters 2 and 3 presented before those from chapter 1, but some of these are also split and rearranged in different points of the passage. Variations in the original extracts are mostly grammatical adjustments to compensate for the portions of text omitted. In addition, we have a paraphrase of the biblical text. In this passage, the compiler combines extracts from different sources. The first is from Chrysostom's Homily 1 on Acts, the second from Homily 87 on John, and the third a fragment by Severus of Antioch preserved in the Andreas CATENA. As one can see, it is apparent that in this case, the compiler does not alter the original extracts. On the contrary, the sentences are left in the original order, and the small changes in the text are limited to synonyms. In this passage, the compiler goes even further in combining extracts from multiple sources, which are free excerpts from different sections of Chrysostom's Homilies on Acts, and the scholium from Severus of Antioch. Not only are the two text portions from Severus' scholium reversed, but additionally, a fragment from Chrysostom is inserted between them, thereby providing an example of genuine mix. Overall, the new text does not present any significant alteration apart from small morphological changes. The paper I have presented summarizes the results of a preliminary analysis I have conducted over the past few months, and I am aware that more work is needed in order to draw clearer final evaluations and conclusions. In particular, the following points need to be addressed: criteria behind compilation practice, redundancy of exegetical material, or preference for a certain author or group of authors, theological positions, the impact of compilation practice on the exegetical profile of the commentary. To what extent does the reuse and mix of extracts shape the exegetical content? Focus on sections for which was not possible to detect any source. Do these contain genuine exegesis, or rather reveal some influence from as yet undetected sources? Comparison with catenae from Ecumenius and Theophylact, the most similar with regard to compilation techniques. Investigate possible relations with other catena types, including those from previously unknown codices singuli. Determine the chronological stage of both catena in the history of catena on Acts. And last, but not least, why are both catenae from GA 886 preserved in fragments? We can suppose that the first commentary was mutilated in the antigraph, but how to explain also the incompleteness of the supplementary catena? In conclusion, even though it is not possible to fill the missing gaps of this fragmentary catenae, I hope I will be able to address the questions arising from what is extant, and ultimately evaluate the weight of these exegetical fragments in the reception of the Acts of the Apostles throughout the Byzantine world and the Middle Ages. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Emanuele, for giving us plenty to think about in terms of the Acts catenae as a whole and these particular commentaries. We have time for 2 or 3 questions, I think, if there are questions or comments or requests for clarification out there, by raising your hand or typing something in chat. Paul, over to you.
Thank you for a very interesting paper. I wonder, on your third point on your summary page about the first catena, you said where you have a section where it's impossible or hasn't yet been possible to detect the source, you're looking to determine whether that's original exegesis or an otherwise unknown source. I wonder how you will determine that, given that we don't know the source. What features will you be looking for that might help you decide one way or another?
Thank you for your question. So the thing is that I have, let's say, I have a doubt about those sections which I have not displayed today, because the focus of today was to simply show how this commentary deserves to be labeled as a catena. But there are some sections which I have not been able to identify through the TLG or in the Andreas catena either. So my question is whether there are other catena manuscripts which I haven't been able yet to analyze, which may contain some of the material that we found in those alleged genuine sections. So I don't know if I properly addressed your question.
I just wondered if there might be any linguistic or verbal clues that show that a term being used in those sections can you tell if it's not characteristic of the compiler of the catena. It looks more archaic, perhaps. I just wondered if there are other clues.
So yes, actually, I think there are, but I'm not sure, quite sure yet. In fact, I didn't display them, but I noticed that in those sections, alleged genuine sections, there are some stylistic features, such as a massive use of parallelism and similitudes. I mean, clauses introduced by osper, oste, or osper, os, and also in the way the compiler organizes some sentences and juxtaposes them one after another. It seems that it cares about parallelism, but it's something that I need to look at. I need to do an in-depth look but later in my research. So thank you for your advice and your suggestion. Yeah.
Thank you. Time for another question or observation, if anyone wishes to come forward with one. I don't see one. So while you're thinking, Paul, to come back to your question, when we were looking at Codex Acinthius and trying to identify the scholia in Codex Acinthius, we found that the catena on the Gospels by Nicetas of Heraclea is a very extensive catena in which he tried very hard to identify his sources. And so even the sort of 16th century catena was helpful in identifying the sources in 7th or 8th century compilations, as well as that sort of stuff which is present in other catenae and is attributed, that Emanuele was talking about. So it really is a question, I think, of looking across the whole tradition to see if there are any hints, plus sort of key verbal things like Severus of Antioch. I think that some of his vocabulary is distinctive in a way that means that we might think of attributing stuff to Severus which hasn't otherwise been preserved in Greek, but maybe they're in Syriac. I mean, this is where other linguistic traditions might help as well.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I don't see any more questions. So at the minute, thank you, Emanuele, again for your paper. Thank you very much.